Alright guys, so continuing from the last video of what specifically shifts the aggregate demand curve, we're going to be talking about the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap. And that's very similar of what we talked about in the previous video. So this will be a very quick review and a very easy concept to understand if you have watched the previous video. So if we talk about the inflationary gap, and I guess I can write out the inflationary gap in this table, inflationary gap. The inflationary gap is essentially what happens when you shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So what would make the aggregate demand curve shift to the right? Well, we know that aggregate demand is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, as we talked about in the previous video. So anything that increases any of these four factors would shift the aggregate demand to the right. So if we shift the aggregate demand to the right, we would have something like this. We would have something where the aggregate demand would shift to the right, and I'll label it AD1, shift to the right. And this new point, the new point where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply meet, would be our new equilibrium point. So from our equilibrium point over here, where we would have full employment and we would have a price level, this equilibrium point of full employment, all right, we would shift our aggregate demand to the right, and our aggregate demand would look something like this with this new equilibrium point. Now, what we need to know when this occurs is that what do we see very obviously? Well, we see a price level, our new price level, our price level increasing. So we'd see our price level would be increasing. And we see that our real GDP, which is denoted by GDP with a sub R, our real GDP would be increasing as well. Okay, so if our real GDP is increasing and our price level is increasing, we know that our unemployment must also be decreasing, because real GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship. So if your GDP is increasing, if you're producing more, then you must have lower unemployment. So this is very important when it comes to the inflationary gap. Inflationary gaps occur when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right because any of these four factors increase. And if that occurs, then your price levels increase, your real GDP increases, your unemployment decreases. And usually, our inflationary gap in the business cycle would be, if we had a quick business cycle, this orange line representing the natural rate of unemployment, if we had a quick business cycle, that would look something like that. We would be somewhere, if we're experiencing an inflationary gap, we would be somewhere here. We would be above the natural rate of unemployment, where we would be having higher GDP, because this is real GDP. The y-axis is real GDP. We would be having higher GDP, lower unemployment, and this is something we would like to call the peak in the business cycle. So we would be having a good economy. Now, for a recessionary gap, it's pretty much the exact opposite. Okay, a recessionary gap. Excuse the bad handwriting, please. So recessionary gap is when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. All right, so we have a new AD1 curve here. It shifts to the left. So we know from our equilibrium here, it goes here, because that's where our aggregate demand and our short-run aggregate supply meet each other. So from this price level, we go down to this price level. So we go down in price level, and from our full employment GDP, we would have a new point here showing the decrease in GDP. So there will be a decrease in price level and a decrease in real GDP, which would lead to a increase in unemployment. Okay, because GDP, unemployment have an inverse relationship. So if you're producing less, there's probably going to be lower employment, so a higher unemployment. More people will be unemployed. And if I was to draw out the business cycle for this, this orange line representing the natural rate of unemployment, we would see real GDP on the y-axis. All right, and our business cycle would look something just like what I drew out there. We would be somewhere here. We would be at the lower point, at the trough in the business cycle, because we're experiencing lower GDP, lower price levels, and higher unemployment. So this would mean that we would be experiencing a recession. We would be at the trough of the business cycle. We would be at the lower end of the business cycle. And keep in mind that this point, this equilibrium point right here, and this equilibrium point right here, are represented by where the green crosses the orange, where the natural rate of unemployment is. So this is where we are naturally, and this is where we would be. We would have an increase in our cycle here if there was an inflationary gap, and this would be where we were starting off, and we would be going down if we had a recessionary gap because of these relationships. So recessionary gap is just talking about the shifts in aggregate demand. We already talked about what could possibly shift the aggregate demand, but this shows how the economy would react to these shifts in aggregate demand. Hopefully this video gives a little bit more clarity on the shifts and why they occur and what happens to the economy in a macro context. I hope this helps out, and I thank you for watching the video.